Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel, and today we're gonna have an honest conversation about the roster of MK1. This includes the pros, the cons, and what the future of the roster could potentially hold. Before we get started, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me on all platforms. Let's get started. This discussion about the MK1 roster is a little bit odd because technically there are two rosters of playable characters in the game. You have your main roster and then you have cameos. Let's start with the main roster. So, in my opinion, MK1 has a solid starter roster. I mean, this is a good place to start from. As I've talked about in the past, there are three characteristics of a solid starter base roster for any fighting game. The first one is classic characters. These are the faces of the franchise, and they are all here in MK1. Scorpion, Sub-Zero, Liu Kang, even Katana and Mileena has seen a huge increase in popularity over the years. They are all here. Even if you don't play Mortal Kombat, you know who these characters are and you know that they are associated with the Mortal Kombat franchise. The second group are returning characters. These are usually characters that are returning from previous versions of the game. This is also characters that we haven't seen in a while, and Mortal Kombat 1 addresses both of those. So from MK11, the only new character that was carried over from MK11 was Garrus, and there were three characters introduced in MK11. The reason why this is important is because when we transitioned from MKX to MK11, half of those new characters introduced carried over into MKX. We did not see that here. The only character that was introduced in Mortal Kombat 11 that made their way over to MK1 was Garrus. The second group under this banner of returning characters would be legacy characters. These are characters who everyone kind of knows and they were around during the last cycle of Mortal Kombat, but maybe they missed a cycle. So characters like this include Reptile, Smoke, Kenshi, and even Tanya, all of which the last time we saw them playable on the roster was Mortal Kombat X. And the last group are the 3D era fighters. And I'm still in shock that so many of them have returned at the same time. But it has been 17 years since these characters have been playable in a Mortal Kombat game. And that is Asura, Li Mei, Reiko, Havoc, and Natara. The third characteristic that I use to determine whether or not a starter roster is great for a fighting game are the new characters. Now, there are technically no new characters on this roster, which is, we'll have a discussion about that later. Under normal circumstances, this would technically be a bad thing. However, because this group of returning 3D era characters haven't been playable for 17 years, and because they've been revamped, and I'm talking about special moves, their looks, what they're doing in the game, what role they have in this timeline, they essentially function as Mortal Kombat 1's new characters. These characters are being reintroduced to an entire new generation of players. Although older players like myself remember them from the PS2 era, this is going to be the first time a lot of players have seen them. So even though there are technically no new characters, I believe the 3D era characters essentially function as this game's new batch of characters. So what are the pros of the main roster? Like I explained, the returning group of 3D era characters to me, and I'm totally biased, I'm admitting that, but the returning group of 3D era characters are the stars of the show. A lot of us have waited incredibly long to play them, and it's great to see them here. And it's good to see not just one or two of them like we saw in MK11. Like, they brought back 5 of them that we have not seen in a long time, which is great. The other pro is that here, the roster is largely informed by the story being told. And this is the case for all NRS games. They tend to choose people or choose playable characters and intertwine them into the story. And they've continued that trend here. And so if you told me about the story on paper, I would expect to see all these characters here. So for the most part, with the exception of one, which we will get to, the roster makes sense. Like, if you told me the story of MK1, I would expect to see these people on the roster. And that, I think that's a reflection of how good the story was this time around. Now the cons. There's 2 gripes I have with the main playable roster of Mortal Kombat 1. The biggest exclusion to me is Jade. Now, I'm not a Jade stan, like she doesn't have to be in every single fighting game, but I definitely understand the frustration with her exclusion this time around. If you recall, she was unexplainably excluded from MKX as well. Like, all those heroes died in MK9 and everyone made it over into MKX in some shape, way, or form, whether that be playable as a Revenant or a non-playable Revenant form in story mode. Like, everyone was there except for Jade. And there was no explanation, she was just gone. And it seems like for MK1, they've done the same thing, because she came back in MK11 and now she's not here. And I'm not saying she has to be on the game. In the game, I'm saying the story they've chosen to tell, it would only make sense for her to be on the roster. We're talking about Sindel is here, Melina is here, Kitana is here, even Tanya is here. And we hear references to Countess Jade in various intros in the game, and for whatever reason, she's not here. So with the story they've chosen to tell, it just seems like an odd choice to not have Jade on the roster. My second gripe, even though I kind of said it wasn't that big of a deal, I think having no new characters is a problem. I understand why there are no new characters in MK1, and it's because the 3D eras are so fresh. But I still think for the longevity of Mortal Kombat as a franchise, I think there needs to be a pipeline of characters that are introduced to the game. And I know that sometimes they don't always get it right. You know, like sometimes they introduce new characters and we're like, what is this? Who is this person? Why are they here? But every new character has a potential to be somebody cool. Kenshi was once a new character. Li Mei was once a new character. You know what I mean? Like, all these new characters deserve an opportunity to really, like, not prove themselves, but get an opportunity to grow a fan base. And I think by cutting off that pipeline in MK1, I'm just not sure that that was the right choice. Now let's talk about the cameo roster. Now, to me, the cameo roster is incredibly polarizing. On one hand, it succeeds in its original mission, which is supposed to be a reference to Mortal Kombat of the past. And that goes with the whole marketing of this being a new timeline, a new era. You know, let's have the cameos be a reference to Mortal Kombat of the past. And I think for the most part, they succeed at that. However, I still think some of the cameo choices are questionable. So I'm just gonna go into the pros and cons. So the pros, first of all, there is also a strong 3D era presence on this roster, much like the main roster. And when you have Frost, Darius, Serena, and even Shujinko as cameo characters, I think that is a positive for sure, because the 3D era characters for me, and again, like I said, I'm a little bit biased, the 3D era characters for me are my favorite group of characters in Mortal Kombat. So I'm glad to see so many of them return in some capacity. The second pro is they do successfully reference classic characters who are also playable on the main roster. Of course, I'm talking about Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Kung Lao. And what I determine successful is that the two versions of the characters are different. They feel different, they look different, and the one on the cameo roster is clearly a reference to Mortal Kombat of the past, which was their intention. So I think that that is great. Number three, it's a great way to bring back super classic characters like Motaro and Stryker. I think these two in particular are classic enough to be referenced, classic enough to be memorable, but I'm not sure that they're classic enough to be revamped or redesigned. So they just strike that sweet spot, and I think the cameo roster is a great place for them. Now, the cons of the cameo roster, I think Sonya Blade as a cameo is unforgivable. I don't care what anyone says. I think as the first lady of Mortal Kombat for this new timeline, they should have had a place for her. Although, I suspect she's coming as DLC, as a story arc, but that's a separate video. Let me know in the comments if you really want to hear my thoughts on that. But what we do know is the cameo mechanic was inspired by a design of Sonya. We know that they have designed her with a drone-like type of gameplay design. She has a drone of some sort, and however they designed her, that drone design evolved into an overall game design of a cameo mechanic. So we know somewhere in NetherRealm Studios that there is a Sonya Blade for this timeline, but for whatever reason she's not on the roster and was just relegated to cameo, and for some reason that stings. And so to me, she deserves to be on both rosters, so hopefully they'll, fix that going down the road. But that's one of my cons of this roster. And secondly, I'm going back on my word. While I do appreciate the effort they put into Kung Lao, Scorpion, and Sub-Zero to be different in terms of like the cameo versus the main roster, I think they should have drawn a line, and this is something I echoed in my coverage and in my content while they were rolling out Mortal Kombat 1. I think they should have just drawn a line in the sand where you have main roster characters and then you have cameo roster characters. I just don't, at least in the current iteration of Mortal Kombat 1, I'm just not sure what only having three characters exclusive to both rosters. I don't really like that. Now, I do know that in the future that will change. And I do know, I would say maybe this is not a con. Maybe this is more of a concern. I'll as I'm talking to you guys right now, I'm kind of like thinking through it, like maybe this isn't a con. But I think as we move forward with Mortal Kombat 1 and as the game continues to get more content, I think we will get to a place where a handful of characters will be both on the main roster and cameo. So for right now, I don't like the fact that we have that only Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Kung Lao get to be cameos. One of the ideas that I had, or one of the thoughts that I had when the game was coming out was like, why aren't the main roster characters, why don't they just have like different moves as cameos? I think that would have been much better, and it would have had a lot of consistency to the game. We do know that there is a foundation for it in story mode. If you guys haven't played it yet, in story mode, you do tag with main roster characters. So I'm not really sure why they didn't take that direction, but I could see why they went this direction, because then you wouldn't have the likes of like Serena, like she wouldn't be in the game because she's not on the main roster. So I would just say that's a concern, but I'm pretty sure it's gonna be addressed in the future of Mortal Kombat 1 as we get more content. For the game. So when you take both rosters together, what does this mean? It means that the character experience in Mortal Kombat 1, and when I say character experience, I mean you, the player, when you boot up Mortal Kombat 1 and you go to these two rosters, you have a solid collection of characters to choose from, and that is, at the end of the day, that's a great thing. The main roster provides just enough freshness and newness, and is complemented very well by the direct references to Mortal Kombat of the past. So while you do have new versions of Liu Kang and Scorpion and Sub-Zero, you are reminded of where they came from because of the Kung Lao version, the cameo version of Kung Lao, as well as Stryker, as well as Motaro on the cameo roster. So I think those two work very well together. And secondly, I think the idea of pairing up different characters to fight does feel great. Like, in what other timeline can you get Tanya assisted by Stryker, Ashura with Frost, Havoc with Motaro? I just think the concept itself is cool, and the way they've laid out the roster definitely helps with that. So that's my discussion for the roster of MK1. I think that overall it is a good place to start from. I do think overall there should have been more characters, but if they do plan to add more characters via a story arc, which is something Ed Boon was always pushing when he was interviewing when he was doing interviews for this game, he always mentioned DLC stories, single player expansion. If that is the road they're going with, I think that there are plenty of Mortal Kombat characters that are coming to MK1, not only as the base roster, but as cameo versions as well. Not to mention, we have DLC, and we know that we're gonna get a ton of DLC characters coming. And what I mean by that is, next month, like, Omni-Man is gonna be in Mortal Kombat 1, which is nuts. And so DLC is on its way, and that is for sure going to change how we approach Mortal Kombat 1 and what the roster feels like. So that's my discussion. Make sure y'all drop a comment down below. Tell me your thoughts about the roster in Mortal Kombat 1. Who would you like to see? Who are you excited to see? How do you feel about it? Let me know how y'all feel, and thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll catch y'all next time. Bye.